I'm Salvatore Babonis, and this is a transcription of a presentation I gave to the Australia-India Political Action Group on The Voice Explained on October 8th, 2023. Australians are being asked to make a change to their constitution by adding a Chapter 9 in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Symbolically, this is a major change. It will create a new chapter for the first time, Chapter 9. This will be the only substantive chapter consisting of a single section, Section 129. This chapter is being added on to the end of the Constitution after the 8th chapter on revisions to the Constitution or amendments to the Constitution. And this symbolic recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is not being added as a section within the miscellaneous provisions chapter, which is Chapter 7. That would seem to be the legal place where it belongs, or the logical place for it, but instead symbolically this is being made its own chapter. Also with the suggestion that perhaps being a chapter of its own with a single section, other sections might later be added to this chapter. Again, if the voice were simply to be this one-time change in the Constitution, it would logically belong within the miscellaneous elements of the Constitution in Chapter 7. The fact that it's being made its own chapter is clearly symbolic, and it is a major symbolic recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Ironically, however, this will return Aboriginal people to the Constitution. Prior to 1967, the word Aboriginal was in the Constitution. That is to say, quote-unquote Aboriginal natives, that is those living in the bush, were not counted in the apportionment of parliamentary seats. Now, that's often been misrepresented as Aboriginal people not being counted, or even that Aboriginal people were not given the vote in Australia. That simply isn't true. What this meant was that Aboriginal people living uncontacted or outside of Australian society in the bush were not given, were not counted in apportioning seats for parliamentary representation of states like Queensland and Western Australia that had very large but non-settled, or at least not in Australian society, settled in Australian society, Aboriginal communities. So this was a tool or compromise made in 1900 to prevent Western Australia and Queensland using potentially vastly overinflated numbers of Aboriginal people to gain extra representation for the white people living in these settled areas of these states. Okay. Also changed in 1967 was the Commonwealth had before 1967 been explicitly prohibited from making laws with respect to Aboriginal people in the states. The Commonwealth could make laws with respect to Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory and the ACT, but not in the states themselves. That is to say that Aboriginal affairs were a state issue before 1967. The 1967 amendments effectively nationalized Aboriginal affairs, transferring them to Commonwealth administration. Substantively, however, the voice changes very little. It means a lot symbolically. It means very little substantively. What the new amendment will do is command the creation of a body called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. Now, the clearest parallel for this is the Constitution in 1900 commanded or called into existence an Interstate Commerce Commission. But then Parliament didn't legislate it for years, and even today the functions of what was to be the Interstate Commerce Commission are embodied in other government departments. So the fact that the referendum says there shall be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice doesn't mean much until Parliament legislates it. What's more, Parliament already has the authority to legislate such a voice under that 1967 amendment, which explicitly gave the Parliament the authority to legislate on matters specific to a particular race, and that particular race in this case would be construed as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. What's more, the voice referendum motion passed handily, 121 to 25 in the House, 52 to 19 in the Senate. Now, it's possible that some of those people who voted in favor were only voting in favor of a referendum, not in favor of the referendum. That is, they wanted to put the question to voters. But I think it's very clear from looking at the positions taken by individual parliamentarians that had Parliament simply raised the question of should it legislate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, it would have done so. Which means that all the referendum really means is that the voice will be in the Constitution as opposed to in legislation. But since Parliament is going to define what the voice is and can do, it matters very little that it's in the Constitution. That is, those who claim it being in the Constitution is a massive substantive change to the Constitution really are missing the point or misrepresenting the point, because in theory, Parliament could just decide that the voice is the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. And legally, it seems to me there's very little that anyone could do about that. So the voice is massively important symbolically, not really important substantively. The amendment does, however, specify one thing, and here's where the substantive concerns about the voice really come into play. This is really the only major substantive issue with the voice. In Clause 2 of the voice referendum, it says that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice may, quote, make representations to the Parliament and the executive government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. That specific power to make representations to executive government is potentially transformative. Now, there have been huge claims made about what that might represent, that the voice could demand to be consulted any time the Reserve Bank changed the interest rates, or any time that, if Australia were to conduct military operations abroad. I think that's very unlikely. But it does mean a real change in how Australia, or the procedures by which Australia is governed. A voice to executive government is potentially tricky. I think a voice to Parliament would have been relatively uncontroversial, and it's unlikely that it would have faced organized opposition the way the voice has, since Parliament already has established consultation procedures. And in fact, the voice was originally and for years called the Voice to Parliament. It was only in the last stages of the framing of the constitutional amendment that Voice to Parliament was changed to Voice to Parliament and Executive Government. The voice to executive government is an unknown quantity. Would the government have to consult before making major decisions, before making any decisions? Which issues would the government have to consult on? On what time frame would they have to consult? Can Parliament define and limit this consultation process? Now, the amendment does say that Parliament would establish rules and procedures for the voice, but ultimately the voice may sue to have wider powers, or wider rights of consultation than Parliament gives it, and that is ultimately going to be tested in court. I think whatever anyone may think about this, whatever anyone may say about this, ultimately someone is going to put this to the High Court, that the constitutional amendment gives the voice a greater authority or a greater right to be consulted than Parliament has given it. And the fact that the right to make representations to executive government is right there in the Constitution will give the High Court the responsibility for defining what is reasonable in terms of a voice to executive government. So ultimately, if you're voting on the voice, your vote comes down to two questions. First, the symbolic issue. Do you want a voice? Do you want Aboriginal recognition in the Constitution? Now, virtually all sides in this debate say that there should be some recognition of Aboriginal people in the Constitution. Different people have different views on what that recognition should be, but it is a major symbolic change to put Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples back in the Constitution. In 1967, Aboriginal people were in the Constitution almost in a negative way. That is, there were prohibitions regarding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Well, between 1967 and 2023, the Australian Constitution has made no mention of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Well, this would positively affirm Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution explicitly. The second substantive issue is whether you want a voice to executive government. A voice to Parliament is relatively non-controversial. Everyone has one. Even I, as a non-citizen resident of Australia, have twice made submissions to Parliament. Parliament has a regular process for hearing public submissions to legislation that it is proposing. And so a voice would simply be an organized mechanism for making submissions during that period of public comment on legislation. Putting a voice to executive government in will then have to be defined, because not all actions of executive government are subject to public comment. There aren't mandated public comment periods for everything executive government does. Which ones of those things executive government does would have to have a period for the voice to be consulted, and whether the executive government making decisions where the voice didn't have time to be consulted, or the voice felt it should have been consulted and wasn't, that is a substantive question that is going to be affected by your vote on this amendment. The actual voice itself will be whatever Parliament legislates, and that's true whether this was a legislated voice or a constitutional voice. The only thing that changes is that Parliament must include in its legislation the ability to have a voice to executive government, whereas if Parliament had merely created a voice on its own, it could choose to have a voice to executive government, but it wouldn't be constrained to do so. Technically, of course, if it's in the Constitution, it's forever. As the no side says, Parliament could not be able to abolish the voice. Practically or technically speaking, again, on that technical level, a future Parliament could completely eviscerate the voice. It could simply say the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs shall be the voice, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. And then the government of the day could appoint that Minister of Aboriginal Affairs or Minister of Indigenous Affairs, and that's the voice. So this question of permanence really isn't the issue. The real issue, the substantive issue on the table, is whether or not there should be a voice to executive government. Well, why have a voice at all? The main theory behind the voice is the idea of sovereignty, the idea that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples form sovereign nations within or alongside Australia. That's reflected, of course, in the use of flags for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people alongside the national flag of Australia, but it also is right there in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has repeatedly stressed that he fully endorses the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and that the Uluru Statement is the prompt for him proposing this voice amendment. So it's not out of left field to bring in the Uluru Statement when the Prime Minister and the Yes campaign and the official government information websites about the voice so prominently feature the Uluru Statement from the Heart as being the reason for having a voice. Now, the Uluru Statement is very clear. You don't have to go to this debate between the short-form Uluru Statement and the 20-page Uluru Statement that's been a big debate in the media. Leave that aside. Let's just focus on the actual short-form Uluru Statement that all sides agree is part of, or at least is, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Okay. That statement, this is an excerpt from it, stresses sovereignty. You see here the notion that sovereignty is a spiritual notion, and sovereignty has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. In other words, the Uluru Statement espouses a kind of two nations theory of Australia. The idea that there are multiple nations, at least two, maybe more, but there are at least two nations existing side by side on this continent, each with its own sovereignty. Now, this goes back to a situation pre-1967. If you think back to the fact that Aboriginal people in the bush were not included in representation to the Australian Parliament, that was because, in a conceptual sense, they were outside the Australian community. Now, by 1967, they were clearly inside it. But go back to 1867, go back to 1800. At an early point in Australia's history, obviously, Aboriginal people formed, whether you want to call them nations or groups or tribes or whatever, they were clearly outside the sovereignty of the settler communities in Sydney and then later throughout Australia. By today, they are inside the Australian community, but the question is, was that sovereignty ever extinguished? The argument of the Uluru Statement is a clear no, that sovereignty, that independent sovereignty continues to exist. The Uluru Statement calls for the establishment of a First Nation voice enshrined in the Constitution, and a fair and truthful relationship between First Nations people and the people of Australia. Now note that the people of Australia are considered as an external people in this conceptualization. The idea is that there are First Nations, there's the Australian nation, and the two separate nations, or again, multiple nations if you want to believe or argue for multiple First Nations, the two separate nations should have a reconciliation. Such sovereignty narratives are widely employed. The Uluru Statement from the Heart uses them, of course, but they're also embedded in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which says that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. Indigenous peoples have the right to just, fair, and equitable compensation for lands taken or occupied. And I will note that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has been signed by Australia under the Kevin Rudd administration in 2009. Australia is a party. Arguably, the UN Declaration mandates a voice. It says that Indigenous peoples have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as a ways and means for financing these functions. That is to say, the settler community has an obligation to finance the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. But by UN standards, the voice does not really go far enough. It really only establishes an advisory council, not an administrative body. It would not give self-government to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It wouldn't create a mechanism by which Aboriginal people spend money themselves, make contracts themselves, teach their own languages to their own people, run their own schools, run their own police services. None of that would be covered by the voice. In fact, the land councils, and in particular the New South Wales land councils, are a much better parallel for what the UN standards under the UN Declaration calls for than is the voice. I would go so far as to argue that the sovereignty theory does not support the creation of the voice envisaged in the proposed constitutional amendment. The sovereignty theory would call for something much more extensive, but more importantly, more directly administrative, more governance-oriented, as opposed to an advisory body. In fact, it's the 1967 race power that offers a much more realistic theory for an advisory body like the voice. In 1967, under Section 51 of the Constitution, the legislative powers of Parliament, the Parliament was given the power to make laws for peace, order, and good government with respect to, quote, the people of any race for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. And in the entire history of this amendment since 1967, only one group has ever been subjected to the race power. That is, the Australian government has only made special laws with respect to one racial group, or at least a collection of racial groups, that is, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. The original race power, as I said earlier, excluded Aboriginal people. The power was there probably intended to allow Commonwealth regulation of the use of Asian and Pacific Islander indentured labor, particularly in Queensland. But the change in 1967 from Aboriginal people being excluded from the race power to Aboriginal people being, or rather, the race power being applicable to anybody, and the fact that since 1967 the race power has exclusively been used with respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, is really a sound and very solid rationale for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people having an organized way to express their views about the power that is being used with respect to them. Special legislation arguably calls for special input. And in fact, after the 1967 referendum, several bodies were created, first by administrative fiat, the Council for Aboriginal Affairs, which was appointed originally, the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee, which was elected, and the National Aboriginal Conference, which was elected. Now, I don't know much about the election procedures for these groups, but they were ultimately based on an electoral mandate. Later, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which has been mentioned very prominently in many of the voice debates, ATSIC, was created by legislation as an indirectly elected body. That is, elections were made for local groups, which then together decided or nominated people for the ATSIC, the commission. Okay. There's also an existing elective representative body, the Torres Strait Regional Authority, TSRA, which is an elected representative body with elections managed by the Australian Election Commission. There are 20 single-member districts. Elections are open and generally competitive. This is not a very controversial organization. It seems to be well respected, and it operates as an organized, not only a voice for those, it operates as an organized voice, I should say, for those, for Torres Strait Islanders who live in the Torres Strait Islands, who can then have a say over special legislation that is being made with respect to the Torres Strait Islands. There's also in the ACT an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elected body. Honestly, I know very little about that ACT body, but the point is that there are working models of elected voices for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that exist in Australia right now. Okay. So what do other countries do? It's often said with the voice debate on one side that the voice would be unique in the world, on the other side that many countries have indigenous mechanisms like the voice. In fact, there are lots of indigenous mechanisms, particularly in our settler democracies. And I'm going to quote here from an article from Professor Michael Leach, but broadly speaking, they fall into four different categories: reserved parliamentary seats, devolved self-government, traditional advisory councils, and indigenous advisory bodies. And that parenthetical statement, the proposed voice fits in this category, an indigenous advisory body, that is a quote from the article. That's Professor Leach's categorization, not mine. Now, I think this advisory body comparison, the idea that other countries have advisory bodies in their constitutions, is not really a good comparison for the voice. So he mentions four advisory bodies. One is Bolivia. Well, Bolivia has an indigenous majority, not a minority, and so Bolivia is really a unique case. But going to the main developed country advisory bodies, New Zealand has the Waitangi Tribunal, but the Waitangi Tribunal is not in the New Zealand Constitution. In fact, there is no written constitution in New Zealand. Arguably, you could say that it is called forth in some way by the Treaty of Waitangi, except that it has not existed. It did not exist for 100 years after the Treaty of Waitangi, which is one of New Zealand's founding documents. It was instead established by legislation, and it specifically makes recommendations about land claims. It is not an all-purpose voice to Parliament and executive government. Similarly, Canada's Indigenous Advisory Committee was established by administrative fiat. It wasn't even legislated. It was simply a council that advises the government, and it makes recommendations to the Impact Assessment Agency, which is a Canadian government agency that assesses the impact of government policies on Indigenous peoples in Canada. Again, it's not in the Canadian Constitution. Canada does have a written constitution, or at least a body of law that is considered a constitution in Canada. It's not mentioned there, and it could be abolished at any time or reconfigured at any time by the Prime Minister without taking outside advice. The third example given by the professor is Taiwan's Council of Indigenous Peoples. This is straight out a government agency. It is, again, not in Taiwan's constitution, but it's also not it is not an autonomous voice within Taiwan. So there really aren't other developed democracies that have advisory bodies of the kind that Australia is contemplating, and they certainly don't have them in their constitutions. There is, however, real Indigenous representation in the sense intended by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that exists in countries like the United States, which recognizes 326 domestic dependent nations, that is the Native American tribes, all of them operating according to democratic procedures, and many of them having their own police forces, their own schools. That is, they actually administer large areas, local government areas, under their own control. And these are not specifically mentioned in the United States Constitution, but the Constitution does give the United States government the authority to make treaties with the Indian tribes, and the treaties are the basis for these domestic dependent nations, so they're indirectly in the Constitution. Canada recognizes 634 First Nations, that is the Native Canadian tribes, under similar terms to the United States of America's Native American tribes. New Zealand has a different mechanism. It has 7 designated Maori electorates, and those do arise constitutionally, you might say, from the Treaty of Waitangi. And Norway and Finland both have Sami parliaments. The Sami are the indigenous peoples of the far north in Europe, close to the Arctic Circle. And in both Norway and Finland, there are legislated parliaments. In fact, both the Norwegian and Finland parliaments are, in passing, mentioned in the Constitution. So in Norway, the Constitution simply says that the state shall create conditions enabling the Sami people to preserve and develop its language. And that mechanism that has been created in Norway is the Sami parliament. Similarly, in Finland, the Sami form a self-government area. So they're equivalent, in many ways equivalent to a United States Native American tribe, and again, they will be provided. So the Constitution does say that an act of Parliament will in some way help preserve Sami linguistic and cultural self-government. And again, these have been legislated in both Norway and Finland to create quasi-sovereign parliamentary units that do self-governance within limited constraints. And like the Native American tribes and the Canadian First Nations, it's sovereignty on the level of a local government unit, not true state sovereignty, but local government sovereignty. Canada's Constitution does mention or recognize the First Nations, but merely in passing, in that it affirms the, quote, existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. So the Canadian Constitution just says whatever treaties were made in the past, those still apply even under the Canadian Constitution. Okay. These forms of self-governance are much more substantial than Australia's proposed voiced parliament. They have legally enforceable rights. In New Zealand, there are rapidly evolving legal theories around the role of Maori in governance in New Zealand. In all these countries, Indigenous bodies can make representations to both legislative and executive government, much in the same way as the Torres Strait Islander regional authority can make representations to both legislature and executive government. But these rights are not constitutionally mandated, or they're, if anything, indirectly constitutionally mandated. What would make Australia unique is its symbolism in putting the voice as a unique chapter of the Australian Constitution, not the mechanism itself. Okay, in sum, Australians are being asked to vote on this amendment to their Constitution. The constitutional voice would be unique. It does not parallel mechanisms that exist in other countries. It will be weaker than the mechanisms in most countries. That is, it will be purely advisory. Also, it is not envisaged to be democratically elected, as all of these other voices in Europe, North America, and New Zealand, they're all democratically elected. Australia's voice would not be. At least the design committee did not even consider the possibility of a democratically elected voice, and there's no reason to believe that Parliament will mandate one. It simply hasn't been mentioned at all in these debates. However, it's not necessarily a problem that Australia's constitutional voice is unique, because Australia's constitutional race powers are themselves distinctive. Some less developed countries, India, Myanmar, Bolivia, have various race powers in the constitution, Malaysia, but developed democracies, and especially settler democracies, simply don't have race-specific powers of legislation the way Australia does, written into their constitutions. Those powers are relatively rare in settler democracies. And it seems quite reasonable to me that if race is going to be in Australia's constitution, and no matter what anyone says about the voice putting race in the constitution, race is right there in the Constitution. Australia makes extensive use of race powers in legislation relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. If race is going to be in the Constitution, it seems quite reasonable that a voice should also be in the Constitution. In short, there's no prima facie argument for or against the voice. It really comes down to your decision. Do you want this symbolic recognition, or don't you want this symbolic recognition? There's then the practical question of the voice to executive government, and that will ultimately be decided by the High Court. It doesn't mean that it will be decided in a bad way. You should just realize that it will go to the High Court for some form of delimitation of the voice's right to be consulted. The two key questions thus for you are, is it symbolically important to put the voice in the Constitution as opposed to establishing it via legislation? And might the constitutional authority to make representations to executive government become a legal wedge? A final note on democratic process. Both the yes and the no campaigns have made claims or have done things that I think really do transgress the norms of democratic campaigning and decision-making. First, the no campaign has thoroughly condemned the actions of companies like Qantas that have taken explicit positions on the voice, even give money to the voice. Well, in all developed democracies, it is commonplace for corporations, I shouldn't say all, in all of our Anglo-Saxon democracies, it is commonplace for corporations to take positions on political issues, in some cases for them even to endorse specific candidates. If Qantas or Wesfarmers or any other corporation feels that it's in the interests of their shareholders to endorse the voice, well, that's a decision that they make. And of course, those shareholders have recourse if they want. They can unseat the boards of directors of these companies, but that's the proper mechanism. Condemning corporations for being involved in the one of the most important political decisions, certainly the most important political decision of the year in Australia, that's just not appropriate. Corporations have a responsibility to do what they think is best for their shareholders and for their communities. And whether or not you agree with what they're doing, they do have that responsibility. On the other side, however, many cities in Australia have simply campaigned using government money for the Yes campaign. I don't know of any that have campaigned no. It is possible, but major cities have taken out, and this includes both Melbourne and Sydney, have taken out advertisements promoting a Yes campaign. In, I think, any reasonable, well-institutionalized democracy, governments cannot campaign on political issues. That is, you can't use public money or public office for political purposes. Now, in Western Australia, this is absolutely prohibited. But in New South Wales and in Victoria, I'm not sure about the other states, apparently it's only prohibited to use public money for political campaigns, that is, to elect somebody, but there's no prohibition on using public money for referendums. I suspect that's an oversight, that no one ever thought about it or thought it would be done, but it is a travesty that public money, that taxpayers are being forced to spend money on a political issue on which they disagree. That really transgresses all of the norms of democratic good governance. Thank you for listening. Good luck whatever side you're on, and I honestly think that this has been a good debate for Australia to have, whatever the outcome might be.